as we said, we're recording. We're jumping into the next song, which, as we just mentioned, is apparently the basis of, I don't know if it's a short story or maybe it was an excerpt that some of you may have studied, The Bishop and the Candlesticks. And before we do that, I'll just, a few more tidbits about the musical. So as we mentioned, the novel was written, was published in 1862. And thank you for that tidbit, that Victor Hugo, the author, was part of the Paris uprising of 1838. So he really was writing something that he knew intimately. And the musical, I mentioned this last time, was originally staged in French in 1980, but then was translated into English and performed first in 1985 in London, and became the longest running musical in the West End in London, and the second longest in the world. And of course was a wild success and a revival and another revival. And it was 1985 at first in London, and then 1986 came to Broadway. And two of the main actors, the actor who played Jean Valjean and the actor who played Eponine in London, became the Broadway actors for those roles. And Jean Valjean was Colm Wilkinson, who became such just an icon in this musical, that what we're going to see today, which is the scene where Jean Valjean comes to the bishop, and the bishop shows him kindness. The bishop is played by a much older Colm Wilkinson now. So the original Jean Valjean, 30 years later, in this 2012 film, more than 30 years later, is playing the bishop. He's a much older man now. And it's beautiful. It's a beautiful role for him. I'll just say, I also discovered that the London performance played it in 2010, played its 10,000th performance. If you could imagine what that's like, the longevity of this show. So we are going to watch this scene. It really is all about kindness from a stranger, and the kindness that this bishop shows to Jean Valjean is the impetus for essentially the rest of his life, for everything that happens afterward. And so we're going to be thinking about an act of kindness that creates a cascading series of events, an act of kindness that leads to other kindness or leads to other events. That's sort of the framing. So we're not going to look at one text. We're going to look at several texts that that are emblematic of this idea of kindness from a stranger that then has a ripple effect in some way. But we begin with Jean Valjean, and I'm showing you a clip from that 2012 film with Hugh Jackman as Jean Valjean. And we're actually picking up exactly where we left off last week. So we had watched that scene of the hard labor of Jean Valjean and the other men schlepping the boat into harbor, and then Jean Valjean being told that he's free to go after 19 years, as he says, a slave of the law after 19 years. So he goes free, and the first thing you're going to see is that he has these papers that say he's on parole. He has to check in every 30 days on parole for the rest of his life. And the scene begins with him deciding that he is somebody new. You'll see how he is treated by the bishop. He's brought in. He's mistreated by law enforcement, but ultimately is shown kindness. I'm sorry. What I'm going to do is I'm going to skip. Oh, I see where I'm going to start. Pardon me. Okay. So this is him walking away from his captors, his imprisonment. And you'll see how hard his life will be as a convict on parole. Okay, nod if you see this. Okay, thank you. I have to say there are many changes from the original musical to the film, and that last line is one of them. The bishop originally says, "I have bought your soul for God," and they changed it to, "I have saved your soul for God," which is more overtly a religious word in the Christian context of saving, of Jesus saves, of the bishop saves his soul. This kindness that Kohl Wilkinson as the bishop, the original Jean Valjean now playing the bishop, is the kindness, as I said, that is the impetus for the rest of his life. So I'm going to share my screen now with our texts, several texts today. And for those who haven't been with us before, just a reminder that at this point in our class, we ask that everyone keep on mute so that we can go through the texts uninterrupted, more or less. And if you have any comments, feel free to use the chat function. And then toward the end of our hour, I'll take down the screen share and we can have a group conversation. So when I thought about the kindness of a stranger that set in motion a cascade of events, this is Pharaoh's daughter taking in baby Moses. Now she doesn't quite sacrifice. I don't know if she sacrifices in the same way that the bishop is giving away his precious silver, but if it weren't for her, there would have been no Moses. So thinking about what made her stop, what made her notice, what made her act, what made her take in an anonymous child who clearly was a Hebrew. I mean, you don't run into babies floating down the Nile every day. So this baby was not going to survive if it weren't for her. And this background is where the Levite family, Yocheved and Amram, the parents of Moses, have a baby. And of course, the backdrop here is Pharaoh's decree that every baby boy born to the Israelites should be killed. So in verse 3, after 3 months of hiding the baby, she could hide him no longer. She gets the basket and protects it and puts the child in the basket among the reeds of the Nile, al sfat hayaor. And verse 4 is that beautiful image of Miriam, the older sister, watching from afar to see what would happen with their baby. So verse 5, we're going to pick up and read this. And each of the texts we're looking at today, we're not going in extreme depth, but we're kind of reading through to get a series, to get a pattern, essentially, a series of events where we see a stranger, the kindness of a stranger. But Tered bat Paro, the daughter of Pharaoh, descended lirchotz al hayaor, to bathe in the Nile. V'na'aroteha hochot al yad hayaor, and of course her maidens walking along the edge of the Nile, escorting her. Vatera et hateva betoch hasuf, she sees the basket within the reeds. Vatishlach et amata vatikacheha, she sends her, here it translates it as her slave girl, to fetch it. Amma can be a servant or a slave. There's a really interesting midrash that says Amma also can mean arm, and that she outstretched her arm, and it even miraculously grew so that she could reach that basket with her own hands and bring it forward. So she's sending out for that basket, whether it's another person or herself, she's drawing in the basket. And that's the moment where she makes the decision, to see what's going on and to look at something beyond her own scope. Vatiftach vatir ehu et hayeled, she opens the basket and sees the child. So essentially, she probably also already heard the baby crying. She knew what was going on, but now she sees the boy. V'hinei na'ar boche, it is a child crying. Vatachmol alav, she takes pity on him. Vatomer mi yaldei ha'ivrim zeh, this is a Hebrew child. How does she know it's a Hebrew child? Well, as I said, babies don't float down rivers every day, and also probably circumcised. So she understands that this baby's been sent away and needs a place to be. Vatomer achoto el bat paro, the sister of the baby, Miriam, takes this opportunistic moment and says, should I go get a nursemaid? One of the Hebrew nursemaids to suckle the child. So, knowing that an Egyptian woman might not want to care for a Hebrew baby, but also knowing that she's going to strategize in this moment and find a way, even for her mother, her own mother, to be that nursemaid. She'll nurse the child. Yes, go, Pharaoh's daughter says, and the girl goes and calls the mother. Brilliant move, Miriam. Very strategic. Vatomer labat paro, helichi et hayeled hazeh. Take this child, nurse him for me. Veheni kehuli. Va'ani etain et scharech. I will pay you. I'm hiring you. So she took the child, she nursed it. And then Pharaoh's daughter, as the baby grows and is weaned, Pharaoh's daughter takes him in, Vayehi la leven, makes him her own son. Vatikra shemo Moshe, and called him Moses. Vatomer kimin hamayim mishitihu, because I drew him in. There's the word Moshe. I drew him in from the water. She calls him Moses. Everyone calls him Moses. She is his mother. She is his adopted mother. And the text makes that very explicit. Now, we don't know much else about Pharaoh's daughter. We don't know how the rest of the palace reacted to her extending herself like this, to bringing in a Hebrew baby into the palace of Pharaoh. We don't know when they find out. Is it only later, after the child's been weaned, and then she takes him in as a young toddler, maybe? But this, of course, this act of kindness, this adoption, is what makes it possible for Moses to survive and to grow and ultimately to save the people. In a deep moment of irony, in a twist of irony, that he's the one who grew up in the palace and then coming back to the palace later and saying, let my people go. So that is story number one. And very much, this bishop saving the soul of this man who will later then become a leader. Very much parallel, if you ask me. The next one we're looking at, I'm just going to check the chat. I see a couple of comments. Okay. Okay, a little Russell Crowe trivia in the chat. Thank you, Paula. So for those who are interested about, wow, he called to make a donation to UTT. Thank you. So Ruth, the story of Ruth, yet another person who is really an outsider and shows kindness, and that kindness leads to more kindness, leads to more kindness, leads to Ruth becoming really a part of the Jewish people and a matriarch of none other than King David. That's how the book ends, remember that. So there are so many moments in the book of Ruth that I could have excerpted. It starts, of course, with her showing kindness to her mother-in-law, Naomi. She doesn't need to stay with her. Naomi's son has died. Both sons have died. Both daughters-in-law, are free to go and stay in their Moabite nation. And that's what Orpah does. But Ruth instead stays with Naomi, who's an older woman, who's alone, who is financially at risk, and wants to stay with her mother-in-law, even as she's leaving Moab and returning to Bethlehem, where they had come from. And so Ruth puts herself in a situation where she is going to be a stranger, where she is going to be an outsider, but she does that as a kindness to her mother-in-law. And this kindness, this chesed, is the driving force of the entire narrative of the book of Ruth, very much like the chesed, the kindness of the bishop, is the driving narrative of the entire rest of Jean Valjean's life. And in this excerpt in chapter 3 of the book of Ruth, it's where Ruth has met Boaz, who was a distant cousin, and has been told by Naomi, yes, he is a relative, and this is our chance to find someone who will do this this mitzvah of yibum, of the levirate marriage, who will maybe marry you and will continue the name of my dead son. And so Ruth goes in the middle of the night, if you recall, she goes to Boaz and wakes him up and basically says, will you marry me? In a little bit less romantic language, but she says, I'm here for you because I want to continue the family line, and you are the Goel, the Redeemer. And he says, wow, you've now shown chesed, you've shown kindness again. So the kindness that Ruth showed the first time was to stay with Naomi. That kindness, actually, I should have mentioned in between these two episodes, the kindness of Ruth toward Naomi is what Boaz hears about first and shows kindness back to Ruth by taking her in and caring for her, making sure she always has a place to glean and get food from, and so on. And now the next kindness here that Ruth shows, as he says, is not to run after the young men, but rather to marry within this family, to continue the family name. So he says in this verse, and now I'm reading from the text itself, Vayomer, Brucha at Lashem, blessed are you to God, Biti, my daughter. It's a term of endearment. Etavd chasdecha acharon min harishon. This latest deed of kindness is greater than the first. Chesed here is translated as loyalty. That's contextually, I guess here that makes sense. But chesed means kindness. You haven't looked for a young man, whether poor or rich. You haven't looked under, all the young men. So now don't fear. Kol asher tumri eselach. I will do whatever you are asking. Ki yodea kol sha'ar ami. Everyone in the gates, all the nation, everyone in the town knows. Ki eshet chayil at. You are an eshet chayil, using that biblical term for the woman of valor. I'm pausing to see some of these comments. Yes, Batya is the name that the Midrash tells us is the name of the daughter of Pharaoh, in case some of you might not know. And yes, she reached beyond her comfort zone. She would have to explain this child to her father and protect the baby from gossip amongst her servants. Yeah, I mean, imagine life in the palace now, what she's got to put up with. Jean Valjean gives the bishop reason not to save him, but only Moses' circumstances give Bat Paro reason not to save him. That's true. Right. Jean Valjean has stolen from the bishop, and he still gives him this compassion. Moses did nothing wrong himself. I think the story, thank you, and keep the comments coming in the chat. I love the feedback. I think the emphasis in Les Mis is on an act of grace, an act that is completely undeserved. And I think, and I wanted to bring that out as well here with the story of Ruth, which is that she has no obligation. She has no obligation to show kindness to her mother-in-law. She's off the hook completely. And yet she does. And you could also say Pharaoh's daughter doesn't need to extend herself for this baby. She has no obligation to a Hebrew slave. So there's a meeting on a human level here. And that is what you see between the bishop and Jean Valjean. And I'm going to play at the end, when he looks back at that episode, he says, he called me brother. Like he's never had a person with power or authority look at him as a human being. For 19 years, he's been seen as a number, not even a person. So they meet on a human level. And that's really what happens here also with Ruth and Naomi, who are essentially foreigners to each other, but they've bonded through this marriage. And now Ruth says, I'm here to stay. And certainly between Pharaoh's daughter and baby Moses. I'm thinking about, I call it baby Moses, the way we talk about it with our preschoolers. The last narrative to give a nod toward the narrative of chesed, of kindness in the Torah. The epitome of kindness is the narrative of Rebecca, of Rivka. Rivka also is showing kindness to a complete stranger, Abraham's servant. And we know, because the text has told us, that this is the servant's sort of test case. Like, whichever young woman will offer me water and also offer to water my camels, really extend herself and extend herself beyond. That's the woman for Isaac. That's the woman I'm going to bring home to Abraham. But of course, Rivka doesn't know that. And all she sees is a stranger showing up at the well, clearly has been traveling with 10 camels. And the servant here, the servant is referring to the servant of Abraham, who we know is Eliezer. The servant ran up to her, Vayaras ha'eved likrata, greets her, and says, Vayomer hagmi'ini na me'at mayim mi kadech. Let me just sip a little bit of water, me'at mayim, asking for a little. And what does she give? A lot. So the text here is emphasizing what he asked for as opposed to what she gave, which was not only to him, but also to these 10 camels. Vatomer shte adoni, she says, drink, my lord. Vatimaher, she rushes. I'm sure I've mentioned this in the past. I can't remember in which class, but Vatimaher, she rushes, is exactly what happened with Abraham serving the strangers. I didn't bring that text. I had to stop somewhere. This text has echoes of that text. Abraham serving the three strangers who end up being 3 angels. He rushes and he goes and he cooks and he prepares. And well, Sarah's probably doing most of the cooking, but she too, Vatimaher, she rushes, she's eager, she's zriza, she is zealous to do this mitzvah of kindness. And that's how we know she's ready to be part of the Abrahamic family and the covenant. So she rushes, she lowers her jar, and she waters him, she gives him to drink. Vatashkehu. Verse 19, Vatecha lahashkoto, she finishes giving him to drink, which means more than just me'at, more than just a little, because there's clearly an extended drinking process here. But Tomer gam ligmalecha eshav, I will draw water also for your camels, ad im kilu lishtot, not only a little bit, but until they've had their fill, which is quite a lot for a camel. And she does the same thing. Vatimaher, vate'ar kada, El hashoket vataratz od el habe'er lishov. So she empties her jar. She goes back and forth, back and forth. You can imagine how many times she's drawing water from the well. Vatishav lechol gmalav, and draws water for all of his camels. I'm just peeking in our chat. Yes, exactly. When we walk by, sometimes we see a homeless individual. We don't think of them as a person, as another human being. I had an experience I'll never forget. When I was living in New York City, this is maybe 20 years ago now, 2004. I remember volunteering at one point for an organization that brought food to homeless people. It's called the Midnight Run. They go in the middle of the night to certain locations around the city. And part of their mission is not just to give food, but to have conversations, to acknowledge people's humanity, as you say, and to give toiletries and all other kinds of support. And so I was told explicitly, don't just hand something, have a talk. And I remember, meeting a homeless person who I used to pass constantly on one of the steps of the church, a couple of blocks from my apartment on the Upper West Side, and actually stopped and had a conversation and found out that he had lost his job at 9/11 because he worked in one of those restaurants, and from there couldn't get another job, and one thing led to another, and it led him to homelessness. And that was the first time I realized how many times I walk by someone and I don't think about their story. Just don't think about them and their humanness. Thank you, Paula. This is a little bit less extreme, but still, she could have walked the other way, but this is a stranger in need. So I want to just shift in our conversation from these narratives to a couple of brief texts that talk about chesed, that talk about kindness, and something that ties together these 3 stories is that these individuals are showing kindness through their actions, through their bodies, in a very physical way. And I thought this text was beautiful in that it compares tzedakah to chesed. Tzedakah being charity that one gives with writing a check, which is also, of course, a great mitzvah, and chesed, which is something that one does with their own hands and feet. So we'll read this. This is from the Talmud in the tractate of Sukkah. Tanu Rabbanan, the sages taught, Bishlosha dvarim gdola gemilut chasadim yoter min hatzdaka. Acts of kindness, chesed, gemilut chasadim, are greater than acts of tzedakah. And here are the three ways in which chesed is greater than tzedakah. Tzedakah b'mamono, charity is done with your money. Gemilut chasadim, bein begufo, bein b'mamono, can be done with your body or with your money, I'd say, and or with your money. But chesed always involves one's person, one's body. Tzedakah la'aniyim, charity by definition is only to the poor. Gemilut chasadim, bein la'aniyim, bein la'ashirim. Kindness is for poor or the rich. So think about, that kindness that Ruth shows to Naomi. I guess Naomi is certainly, as I said, financially at risk, but she's not, giving her food to eat or water to drink when she's in need. It's a different kind of kindness. It's companionship. It's, to combat her loneliness, her isolation, her grief, right? Having lost her husband and sons. So that's the chesed as opposed to a tzedakah. And this I find particularly beautiful. Tzedakah l'chaim. Charity is only something we do for the living. We can give somebody money. Gemilut chasadim, bein l'chaim, bein lametim. We can do chesed to someone even after they pass. And this is a reference to the chesed of chesed shel emet, of kindness to the deceased. So even offering burial to someone is considered a chesed, considered a kindness. We call this chesed shel emet, true kindness, because it's inherently unidirectional. When we do a kindness for someone who's no longer alive, we know we're not going to be repaid. And so this is true kindness, pure chesed, chesed shel emet, true kindness. And the other kindness that's referred to, of course, for the dead in the book of Ruth is what in another part, chesed, oh my gosh, the great, I'm losing the verse now, it's at the tip of my tongue, but Boaz says, Naomi says to Ruth, God has shown kindness to the living and to the dead, because Ruth's whole project in agreeing to marry Boaz is to show kindness to this deceased, so to speak, to honor the memory of her deceased husband. So that's a kindness in Ruth that is to the deceased. And thank you for the comment about Naomi mentoring Ruth to return to Jewish community. Yeah. Yes. And I see another comment about how she did it out of love. Yes. Yeah. And, the story of Ruth's return to Judaism or conversion to Judaism or entering the community, however one wants to define that, there's so many ways that story is told. It's interesting because she starts it clearly on her own when she says, your nation is my nation, your God is my God, but it's the beginning of a long process. And Naomi is part of that. And Boaz is clearly part of that. And then the townspeople are part of that. I'm going back to our study of the book of Ruth for those who were with me when we did our 5 Megillot, our study of the book of Ruth, and how she's accepted ultimately at the end of the book. She's accepted into the community, but it all is because of her chesed as the impetus. Yes, and Naomi guides her in how to gain Boaz's favor. Thank you. One final text or pair of texts here, because we couldn't talk about chesed without showing the way that Gemilut Chasadim is understood to be one of the foundations of Jewish life. And this is articulated so clearly in Pirkei Avot. Shimon HaTzadik Haya Mishyarei Knesset Hagdolah. This is the very beginning of Pirkei Avot. And so the men of the Great Assembly, this is the earliest generation of the rabbis. Shimon HaTzadik was among them, and he used to teach. His emblematic teaching was Al Shlosha Dvarim Ha'olam Omed. The world stands upon 3 pillars, a 3-legged stool. So with that image, it's important that if you take one leg out, the other 2 are not sufficient. Al HaTorah, Ve'al HaAvodah, Ve'al Gemilut Chasadim. Torah, which can be Torah learning, Torah study, Torah observance. Avodah, worship, which here is translated as temple service. One could say it's avodah, prayer, worship of any kind, but relationship with God, and gemilut chasadim, relationship with other human beings, kindness to other human beings. This Bartanura is the just elaboration and commentary on the Mishnah that that beautifully quotes Olam Chesed Yibaneh from Psalms, from Tehillim. The world is built up by kindness. And what is it when we say Gemilut Chasadim? What kinds of things are we referring to? These kinds of kindness, which are done with our bodies. L'sameach chatanim, to bring joy to brides and grooms. Lenachem avelim, to bring comfort to mourners. Levaker cholim, to visit the sick. Vilikbor metim, and to bury the dead. V'chayotze bazeh, and such actions. All of these could have tzedakah involved as well. If you could imagine a poor bride and groom who needs help making a wedding, if you could imagine, someone who passes away and the family can't afford a burial, or they don't have any surviving family, but ultimately, it's not only the finances, as we saw in that text above. It's also what one does with one's body, and what can I say? That's what the bishop does: gives him food, gives him drink, gives him a place, and also calls him brother, and also acknowledges his humanity. So I know I've said a lot. I'm going to actually skim back to the top. This is a long source sheet. I had forgotten to put this in the chat before, and so I'm going to do that now. Oh, it's hard for me to do this all at the same time with my screen. Here we go. Okay. And I see another comment in the chat. Give me a moment. Yes, okay. So anyone who wants to access that Safaria source sheet, it's right there in our chat. So what we've seen were three examples, three biblical narratives where a stranger's kindness leads to more kindness, or leads to leadership, I'll say here. Pharaoh's daughter saves Moses. Moses, interestingly, is not really known for his kindness. He's known for his leadership. He's known for his spirituality. He's known for saving the Jews and bringing them the Torah at Sinai. He's not known for his chesed, interestingly. Ruth, who of course is known for her kindness, her chesed, a series of kindness that comes from her first act of kindness. And Rebecca, who is known for her chesed, who is selected because of her chesed to join the chesed family, if you will. This beautiful text about what chesed, what elements sort of exemplify chesed as opposed to tzedakah. And finally, the world sits upon acts of kindness, among other things. And then I liked this quote, which I found from Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, to just end our conversation here. When I was young, I admired cleverness. Now that I am old, I find I admire kindness more. And I guess it just goes to show, as we get older and wiser, we understand what matters is this kind of a chesed, these acts of kindness. So here we are. And by the way, I don't know if everybody knows about this function, but when we pin my video, it makes me big. But if you'd rather see the whole Zoom room, you can always go to the top corner of your screen where it says view, and you can select gallery view. You can always see everybody in that way if you'd like. But put a hand up, either a physical hand to the screen or a virtual hand, a Zoom hand. And I see David has something to say, and Paula has something to say. And so we'll start with the two of you, and then we'll see what happens next. Go ahead, David. Okay.
I just wrote in the...
I just noticed you had a comment here. I didn't see it.
There's my comment.
This seems to be a female-centric cast of characters I've given us.
Yeah.
Well, Avraham, okay. Avraham is the chesed master. That was the response you got there in the chat. And that's why we needed to see if Rebecca was going to show herself to also exemplify kindness. Other,
What about with David? Was there nobody who was kind to David? Somebody who saved him in a desperate situation?
I was going to say David himself is not too kind.
No. But I remember him fleeing from Saul. Somebody was kind
well,
to him.
Jonathan is his friend, but it's more. Oh yeah, Lot shows kindness to the angel visitors, meaning shows Lot is part of that Abrahamic family hospitality, one could say.
Yeah, but I remember David was fleeing from Saul.
Yes, Jonathan.
No, somebody else. Somebody gave David shelter, no, when he was fleeing from Saul. I can't remember the name.
Rachav gives shelter to the spies.
That's another one, no.
In the book of Joshua. Well, anyway, it's but I want to answer also this gender question is interesting. Even in the modern Jewish community, we sometimes fall across gender lines where we say, at least until very recently, that study was the domain of men and chesed was the domain of women. And of course, that's shifting and changing all the time. But I don't know if that is nature or nurture. I don't know if that's because women tend to be more relational. We could stereotype that way, or we could say that that's simply often true. Or because that's where they could exercise any power or autonomy, because yeshivas weren't open to women, because leadership of other kinds weren't open to women. Miriam wasn't the person at the front splitting the sea. She only got to sing about it later. So I don't know. Let's sort of put a pin in that and think about it. And if anyone else has a comment on that, we can get to that as well. I saw Paula's hand. Thank you, David. Do you want to share your thoughts?
Yeah. So the comment about acts of human kindness, I was fortunate enough to take a course with Rabbi David Hartman, Oliver Sholmet McGill, late 60s. And I remember this so clearly, that he said, when you look at, because of Nazi Germany in particular, culture, education is of no value to him. What was important to him was the kindness and I remember that so clearly, and it's like 50 plus years or something. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for bringing Rabbi Hartman into our Zoom room. Was there somebody else who wanted to unmute? Oh, thanks for that comment, Annie. I have to look it up. I haven't looked at those stories in so long about David being sheltered. Susan, do you want to unmute? Are you waving?
So what, maybe you have told us about this before, but what is the initial first Shiva? Where do we get it? That's kindness.
Yeah, we do have the mourning that Jacob's sons do for his father. I have to look back. But that's not understood as a Shiva in the way that we talk about Shiva visits as kindness. That's discussed in terms of mourning the loss. But the kindness more is the burial. And what we see again and again in the Torah is a parent saying to a child, bury me like Yaakov wants to be buried with in Ma'arat HaMachpelah, or Joseph wants to be buried Jacob wants to be buried not in Egypt, but in Israel, in Ma'arat HaMachpelah. Joseph wants to be buried, or wants his bones to be brought to the land of Israel. So, in the classic sense, the comforting of mourners, I think, comes later, but the burial as kindness to the dead, it's kindness to someone who can't do this for himself or herself, is the chesed.
Right. So now there are all kinds of burials. Some people, a lot of Jewish people, no longer want burial in the ground. Is
Right.
it more important to obey what the person who dies, what he would like, or the Jewish law?
Yeah, I know what you're asking. This is such a sensitive question, and it comes up quite a lot. If someone wants to be cremated, for example.
Right.
uh,
Or,
yeah.
but the Jewish, where do we get
Yeah.
the
What's
Jewish law that you have to be buried in the ground?
so there's the way that I would articulate this dilemma is for let's say it's a child who lost a parent. They have two opposing mitzvahs. On the one hand, it's kibud av va'em, honoring your parents and honoring their wishes. And on the other hand, it's this imperative to bury the dead in the Jewish way, which is we don't destroy the body, we bury the body. And that's quite important as well. And it's very personal and it's very individual because, for example, sometimes the parent has made those arrangements for themselves. In other words, they've, paid for the cremation, or they've arranged it, and then the child is put in a position to undo it. And that, I think, is harder because it's very clearly going against what your parent already did. And in that way, it's actually easier to say to the child, just leave well enough alone. You haven't done anything. It's your parent who did this. But if it's the child who's put in a position to arrange, it's much more complicated, and it's not for a communal answer.
Okay.
Because I've seen answers on both sides. And you won't catch me recording myself saying one or the other.
That was.
Esther, I see you have a hand. What's that, Susan? What's that?
It wasn't my intention.
No, I know that. I know.
Like
But what happens often, rabbis will say, this is not for publishing. This is just personally for me and you to have a conversation that has to do with your family and your decision. But you've raised exactly that. That's the conflict. It's chesed and chesed. It's kindness and kindness. It's kavod and chesed. It's these. Most of the time when there's a real halachic question, it's two competing halachot or two competing values, both of which are important. So how do we choose?
Thank you.
Sure. Go ahead. Thank you.
How far back does the act of burying in the ground go in our religion? When did it start?
I have
When
to look
was
that up. I have to look that up.
the reason I asked that?
Yeah.
The reason I asked that, I'm reading a book, and it takes part after the Holocaust. And it goes back from present time to the early part of the 20th century, when all of the things that led up to the Holocaust happened. And one of the statements that really hit me was, make sure we're buried in the ground, because we don't want our ashes to be something like happened in the Holocaust.
I'm
So-
seeing the comments in the chat are very similar here. Yeah. But let's be clear, it was always against Jewish law, even before we had this terrible association with crematoria. It would have always been forbidden. Now we have an additional cultural, visceral abhorrence of this idea of cremation, but it would have been forbidden, of course, even before. And what complicates things, the reason many people in modern times are choosing cremation is that they say it's better for the environment. It's not going to waste a space in the ground. They come up with environmental reasons, which is also a value.
Yes, but there's another one, a very important thing that I think plays a part. They may say that at the time as well, but it's also, I think, about the money. It's much cheaper to be.
Yes, that's true too. Yes, they say I don't want to waste my family's money. I'd rather give it to my kids to use, and benefit from instead of. Yeah. So I mean, I'm trying to be very neutral in the way I talk about it, simply because I understand all the perspectives. There is a very clear Jewish law perspective, which is that, cremation is against Jewish law. But
Yeah.
I'm not judging anybody who feels that way internally, because I understand those other sentiments. I see Annie, you have a hand raised. I want to
I wanted
recognize
to
that.
say about the burial, we have the first example of Abraham who purchases the cave of Machpelah for
Yes.
burying his wife, and then the other patriarchs are buried there too. So for someone who wanted to know what is the burial in the ground, I think it's first recorded in the Torah there, right? That's far back.
Is it clear, however, that she is buried in the earth rather than in what's the word I'm looking for?
Shroud?
Mausoleum or whatever. It's
Oh.
because the focus in that story is, I think, about, yes, this mitzvah of burying the dead, this obligation one has, this kindness that, and also the acquiring of a plot of land in Israel, which is very significant there, that he owns this burial plot. And I think the question here is more about the treatment of the body itself. I don't know if that comes up in that story.
I don't think so. And I think
Yeah.
only since they've uncovered the entrance to the cave of Machpelah that we really know that there was
Right.
burial in the ground.
Right.
So yes, you're right.
Okay, I want to close. Is there any other burning comment? Burning question? And I had a comment about cremation being worse for the environment. I want to say, I know that there's also sort of a trend for people to be put, I don't even know how this works. Like you become a tree or something, like they put the body in some kind of a sack and then put it in the ground. I don't know. It showed up on a sitcom I was watching also. Don't quote me on that. But I think environmental concerns are very much on people's minds in life and in death. So we'll close with this other song from Les Mis, where we see Jean Valjean very explicitly saying, the bishop showed me this kindness, and now I'm going to pay it forward. And it's, fast forward in his life, he has done away with his identity as Jean Valjean. He's become the mayor of the town, the owner of a factory. He's become quite the upstanding citizen. And what we're going to see is that that song he sings, "Who Am I?" after they have captured Jean Valjean, which is another person they think is Jean Valjean, and he has to decide, am I going to reveal that I'm really Jean Valjean? So am I going to put myself at risk to save another person's life, essentially? And that's the song we'll see. And I have a feeling we'll come back to this over the next couple of weeks, because this song is so important in the musical. But I just want you to hear the point where towards the end of the song, he says, he gave me hope when hope was gone. He gave me strength to journey on. That's, of course, the bishop. That's the scene that we watched. And because of that, he decides that he is going to reveal his identity to save another person. And then he's going to have to flee and be on the run for the rest of his life, essentially. Here we are. And so those two candlesticks follow him throughout his journey, throughout the movie. That's something the movie did that the play hadn't, which is carry this bishop narrative through to the end. So thank you for joining me. See you next week here on Broadway. Stay warm,